My name is Margaret, and I'm 67 years old. What I'm about to share with you happened 3 years ago at Riverside Community Church in Tennessee, where I had been a faithful member for over 15 years. It was a Wednesday evening Bible study meeting, and I had arrived a little early, as I always did, carrying my worn leather Bible and a homemade apple pie for the fellowship time afterward. The sanctuary was filling up slowly, and I chose my usual seat in the third row from the back, on the left side near the wall. At 280 pounds and standing just 5.4, I had learned over the years to be strategic about where I sat. This particular spot gave me easy access to the aisle without having to squeeze past too many people, and the wall provided some support for my back during longer services. I was settling in, arranging my Bible and reading glasses, when I heard a voice behind me that made my blood run cold. It was Diane Patterson, a woman in her early 50s who had joined our church about 2 years prior. She was one of those people who always seemed to have something critical to say, but she did it with such a sweet smile that many people didn't realize how cruel her words really were. "Oh my goodness, Linda," she was saying to her friend, not bothering to lower her voice. "Look at Margaret over there. I swear she gets bigger every time I see her. How does someone let themselves go like that? And at her age, too. It's just embarrassing. I mean, doesn't she realize that her body is supposed to be a temple of the Holy Spirit? What kind of temple is that supposed to be?" The shame hit me like a physical blow. My cheeks burned with embarrassment, and I felt my hands start to tremble. I pretended to be reading my Bible, but the words were blurring through the tears that were threatening to spill over. Linda, to her credit, seemed uncomfortable with Diane's comments and tried to change the subject, but Diane wasn't finished. "I'm serious," she continued, her voice carrying that fake concern that cruel people use to justify their cruelty. Someone should really talk to her about taking better care of herself. It's not healthy, and frankly, it's not a good witness to the community. When people see Christians who can't even control their eating, what kind of message does that send about our faith and self-discipline? I wanted to disappear. I wanted to get up and walk out, but I was trapped by my own body and my own shame. Getting up would mean drawing even more attention to myself, would mean squeezing past other people, would mean confirming everything Diane had just said about me. So I sat there, frozen, feeling smaller and smaller, even as I was being mocked for taking up too much space. What made it even worse was that this wasn't the first time. Over the past 2 years, since Diane had joined our congregation, I had noticed more and more subtle digs about my weight and appearance, comments about healthy living during Sunday school discussions, pointed looks when I participated in potluck dinners, suggestions about accountability partners for lifestyle changes that were clearly directed at me. But this was the first time she had been so openly cruel, so publicly humiliating. And it was happening in the place that was supposed to be my sanctuary, my spiritual home, surrounded by people who were supposed to be my brothers and sisters in Christ. If this story of a plus-size woman's courage has already moved you, leave your like now so that more people can watch this video. 2. Understand the full impact of what happened to me that evening. You need to know who I was before that moment of reflection changed everything. My name is Margaret Louise Thompson, and for most of my 67 years, I had been what people call a good woman, the kind who puts everyone else's needs before her own, who volunteers for every church committee, who never says no when someone needs help. I was born in 1957 in a small town in Kentucky, the youngest of 5 children. My mother, God rest her soul, was a woman of incredible strength who raised us kids mostly on her own after my father died in a mining accident when I was just 12. Money was always tight and food was often scarce, but somehow Mom always made sure we had enough to eat, even if it meant she went without. Maybe that's where my complicated relationship with food began. In our house, food was love. It was comfort. It was celebration. When I got good grades, Mom would make my favorite cornbread. When I was sad, she'd fix me a bowl of her famous chicken and dumplings. Food was how we showed care for each other, and it was often the only luxury we could afford. I married my husband Robert when I was 21, and he was the love of my life for 38 beautiful years. Robert never once made me feel bad about my weight, not even when I gained 60 pounds during my pregnancy with our daughter Sarah and never lost it all afterward. He would tell me I was beautiful every single day, and I believed him because the love in his eyes was so genuine. We moved to Tennessee when Robert got a job at the automotive plant, and that's when we found Riverside Community Church. It became our second home. Robert served as a deacon, and I threw myself into every ministry I could find. I taught Sunday school for 20 years, organized the annual church bazaar, coordinated meals for families in crisis, and ran the Children's Vacation Bible School program every summer for a decade. After Sarah grew up and moved to California, with her own family, Robert and I settled into a comfortable routine. He would work his shifts at the plant, and I would keep busy with church activities and caring for my elderly neighbors. I had a reputation in our community as someone you could count on. Need someone to sit with you at the hospital? Call Margaret. Need meals for your family after surgery? Margaret would organize it. Need someone to clean the church or decorate for special events? Margaret was your woman. But underneath all that service and giving, I was struggling with something I never talked about. My relationship with food had become complicated and painful. After Robert died 5 years ago from a sudden heart attack, eating became my primary comfort. I would make his favorite recipes and eat them alone at our kitchen table, crying into my mashed potatoes and remembering better times. The pounds crept on slowly at first, then more rapidly. My clothes got tighter. My energy got lower and my world got smaller. But I told myself it was just grief, that it was normal, that it would pass. I threw myself even more deeply into church work, volunteering for everything, saying yes to every request, because staying busy meant I didn't have to think about how lonely I was or how ashamed I was becoming of my body. By the time Diane Patterson joined our church, I was already carrying the weight of years of emotional eating, grief eating, and shame eating. I was already feeling vulnerable and self-conscious about my size. I had already started avoiding social situations outside of church, had stopped dating even though several nice widowers had expressed interest, had stopped buying new clothes because shopping had become too humiliating. But at church, I still felt valuable. I still felt needed. I still felt like I belonged somewhere. The older members of the congregation had known me for years and still treated me with the respect I had earned through decades of faithful service. They saw past my physical appearance to the woman I was inside, or at least I thought they did. The impact of Diane's words that Wednesday evening was devastating in ways that I'm still processing even now, 3 years later. As I sat there in that church pew, listening to her mock my body and question my faith, something inside me shattered that had taken me 64 years to build. The immediate physical response was overwhelming. My heart started racing so fast, I thought I might be having a heart attack. My hands began to shake uncontrollably, and I had to grip the edge of the pew to steady myself. A hot flush of shame washed over my entire body, starting at the top of my head and spreading downward, like poison through my veins. I could feel sweat breaking out on my forehead, despite the air conditioning in the sanctuary. But the emotional impact was even worse than the physical. For the first time in my life, I felt completely and utterly alone in a room full of people who were supposed to love and accept me. The walls of my spiritual home suddenly felt like they were closing in on me, trapping me with my humiliation and my shame. What hurt the most wasn't just what Diane said. It was the realization that she felt comfortable saying it. That meant she believed others shared her opinion. That meant she thought her cruel words would be met with agreement rather than correction. That meant that maybe, just maybe, other people in my church family had been looking at me with the same disgust and judgment. They just hadn't been brave enough or cruel enough to voice it out loud. I started replaying every interaction I'd had at church over the past few months through this new, painful lens. Mrs. Henderson's comment about watching what we eat during the ladies' auxiliary meeting. Pastor Williams's sermon about taking care of our bodies as temples of the Holy Spirit that seemed to be directed right at me. The way some of the younger women would smile politely but never really engage in conversation with me during fellowship time. Had they all been talking about me behind my back? Had I become the object of pity and disgust without even realizing it? The thought was absolutely crushing. I thought about all the years I had given to this church, all the time I had volunteered, all the money I had donated even when I could barely afford it, all the love and energy I had poured into this community. And this was how I was being repaid, with public humiliation and cruel judgment about something that had nothing to do with my character, my faith, or my worth as a human being. The worst part was that somewhere, deep down, a terrible little voice was telling me that maybe Diane was right. Maybe I was embarrassing. Maybe I was a bad witness. Maybe I was letting everyone down by not being able to control my weight. Maybe I deserved to be mocked and shamed because I had failed at something that seemed so simple to everyone else. Just eating less. That night, after the Bible study was over and I had somehow managed to make it through the rest of the evening without completely breaking down, I went home to my empty house and cried harder than I had cried since Robert's funeral. I stood in front of my bedroom mirror and saw myself the way Diane saw me, not as a beloved child of God with inherent worth and dignity, but as a fat, disgusting failure who had let herself go and was embarrassing everyone around her. I made a decision that night that I would never go back to that church. I couldn't face the humiliation again. I couldn't risk another public shaming. I couldn't bear the thought that every time I walked into that sanctuary, people would be looking at me and thinking the same cruel thoughts that Diane had been brave enough to voice. But then I realized that giving up my church would mean giving up the only community I had left. It would mean abandoning the ministries I cared about, the people I served, the purpose that got me out of bed every morning. It would mean letting Diane Patterson drive me away from the place where I had found meaning and belonging for 15 years. And that realization made me angrier than I had been in a very long time. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep because of the humiliation burning in my chest, my mind began to wander back through decades of similar experiences. Diane's cruelty hadn't happened in a vacuum. It was just the latest and most public example of a lifetime of being judged, mocked, and diminished because of my body size. I remembered being 14 years old and trying on dresses for my first school dance. My mother had saved up money she didn't have to buy me something special. But when we got to Miller's department store in town, the saleswoman took one look at me and said, "Oh, honey, I don't think we carry anything in your size. You might want to try the women's section." The shame of shopping in the women's section as a teenage girl, surrounded by clothes designed for middle-aged bodies, was crushing. I ended up not going to the dance at all. I remembered my wedding day in 1978, when my future mother-in-law made a comment about hoping I would slim down before the ceremony because she was worried about how the wedding photos would look. I spent the 6 months before my wedding on every diet known to womankind, losing and gaining the same 20 pounds over and over again, stressed and anxious about whether I would be pretty enough, thin enough, good enough to deserve Robert's love. I remembered job interviews in my 20s and 30s where I could see the disappointment in employers' eyes when I walked through their doors. I was qualified for every position I applied for, but somehow there was always a better candidate, usually one who was 30 pounds lighter and 10 years younger. I finally found steady work at a small insurance office where the elderly owner, Mr. Patterson, didn't care what I looked like as long as I could do the job well. I worked there for 28 years until he retired and sold the business. I remembered doctor visits where my weight was the only thing that mattered, regardless of why I had come in. Sinus infection? You need to lose weight. Sprained ankle? The extra weight isn't helping. Annual physical? 20 minutes of lecturing about diet and exercise, 5 minutes of actual medical care. I started avoiding doctors altogether unless I was truly desperate. which probably wasn't the healthiest choice, but felt like the only way to protect my emotional well-being. I remembered trying to buy clothes over the years and the humiliation of having to shop in special sections or special stores, of being made to feel like my money wasn't as good as thin people's money, of sales clerks who acted like they were doing me a favor by helping me find something that fit. I remembered the joy I felt when plus-size fashion finally became more available, only to have it relegated to hidden corners of stores or separate entrances, as if our very presence might contaminate the regular clothing. I remembered airplane trips to visit Sarah in California, where I would have to ask for seatbelt extenders and endure the annoyed sighs of fellow passengers who thought I was taking up too much space. I remembered restaurant booths that were too small, movie theater seats that left me feeling squeezed and uncomfortable, and concert venues where I would spend more time worrying about fitting than enjoying the performance. But perhaps the most painful memories were the ones from other church experiences over the years. The youth pastor who suggested I might not be the best choice to lead the teenage girls group because I didn't present the right image. The church potluck where someone made a joke about me being first in line for food, and everyone laughed as if cruelty was funny when it was wrapped in humor. The Bible study leader who used me as a negative example when discussing gluttony as a sin, apparently not caring that I was sitting right there in the circle. What struck me as I lay there remembering all these painful moments was how I had internalized every single one of them. Instead of getting angry at the people who were treating me cruelly, I had gotten angry at myself. Instead of recognizing that their behavior said something about their character, I had decided it said something about mine. Instead of standing up for myself and demanding better treatment, I had shrunk into myself and tried to take up even less space in the world. I had spent decades apologizing for my existence, making myself smaller emotionally to compensate for being larger physically, and accepting treatment that I would never have tolerated if it had been directed at someone else. I had become complicit in my own dehumanization, and that realization was almost more painful than any of the individual incidents I was remembering. But something else was happening as I laid there in the darkness, cycling through these memories. Along with the pain and shame, I was starting to feel something I hadn't felt in a very long time: anger. Not anger at myself for being fat, but anger at a world that had taught me that my worth as a human being was determined by the number on a scale. Anger at people who thought they had the right to comment on my body as if it were public property. Anger at a culture that had convinced me that I deserved to be treated poorly because I didn't fit into a narrow definition of acceptable female appearance. And most of all, I was feeling anger at myself for accepting it all for so long. The turning point came 3 days after the incident at church, on a Saturday morning when I was supposed to be preparing the Sunday school lesson for my class of senior women. I had been a Sunday school teacher for 20 years, and preparing lessons was usually something I looked forward to, a time to dive deep into Scripture and think about how to present biblical truths in ways that would be meaningful and relevant to the women in my class. But that Saturday, I couldn't focus. Every time I tried to read the text we were studying, a passage from Ephesians about being fearfully and wonderfully made, I kept hearing Diane's voice in my head, mocking my body as an inadequate temple of the Holy Spirit. The irony wasn't lost on me that I was supposed to teach other women about God's love and acceptance while feeling completely unloved and unacceptable myself. I closed my Bible and walked to my bedroom, where I stood once again in front of the full-length mirror that had witnessed so many moments of self-hatred over the years. But this time, instead of focusing on everything I thought was wrong with my reflection, I forced myself to really look, not with the eyes of judgment I had learned from the world, but with the eyes of someone trying to see what God sees. Saw a 67-year-old woman who had survived the death of her father as a child, who had raised a successful daughter, who had loved her husband faithfully through 38 years of marriage, and who had served her community with dedication and compassion for decades. I saw hands that had prepared thousands of meals for people in crisis, arms that had hugged countless children during vacation Bible school, and a body that had carried me through all the challenges and joys of nearly 7 decades of life. Yes, I was fat. There was no denying that. But as I stood there looking at myself, I began to ask different questions than the ones I had been asking all my life. Instead of, "Why can't I lose weight?" I started asking, "Why do I believe that my weight determines my worth?" Instead of, "What's wrong with me?" I started asking, "What's wrong with a world that teaches women to hate themselves?" I thought about my daughter Sarah, who had inherited my body type and had struggled with her weight throughout her life. I thought about the messages I had inadvertently sent her about body image and self-worth. I thought about my granddaughter Emma, who was now 15 and already showing signs of the same self-hatred that had plagued the women in our family for generations. What kind of legacy was I leaving for them? I realized that by accepting the cruel treatment I had received over the years, by internalizing the message that fat women deserve to be mocked and shamed, I was contributing to a culture that would continue to harm the women I loved most. I was teaching them, through my example, that their worth as human beings was conditional on their dress size. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I decided that I was done apologizing for taking up space in the world. I was done shrinking myself to make other people comfortable. I was done accepting cruelty as if it were justified. I was done believing that my body was an embarrassment or a failure or a source of shame. But more than that, I decided I was going to go back to church the next morning. Not because I wanted to face Diane Patterson again, but because I refused to let anyone drive me away from my spiritual home. Not because I enjoyed being the target of cruel comments, but because I had as much right to worship there as anyone else. I made a decision to reclaim my space, my dignity, and my voice. I spent the rest of that Saturday afternoon rewriting my Sunday school lesson. Instead of teaching about being fearfully and wonderfully made as an abstract concept, I decided to make it personal. I decided to share my own story of struggling to believe that God could love me exactly as I am. I decided to challenge the women in my class to think about how we treat people whose bodies don't conform to societal expectations. But I also made another decision that day, one that would have much bigger consequences than I could have imagined at the time. I decided that if Diane Patterson wanted to use church as a place to shame and humiliate people, I was going to make sure everyone could see exactly what kind of person she really was. I had spent my whole life being nice, being accommodating, being the good Christian woman who turned the other cheek no matter how many times it got slapped. But there's a difference between being Christ-like and being a doormat, and I was finally ready to learn that difference. And you, plus-size woman who is watching, have you ever been through something similar? Share in the comments and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more empowerment stories. That Sunday morning, I woke up before dawn with a mixture of nervousness and determination that I hadn't felt in years. I had made a decision to go back to church, but I knew it had to be different this time. I couldn't just slink back into my usual seat in the back and hope no one noticed me. I had to show up as someone who deserved to be there, someone who belonged, someone who wouldn't be intimidated or shamed into silence. I started with something that might seem small but felt revolutionary to me. I chose what to wear based on what I liked, not on what might hide my body or help me blend into the background. For years, I had been dressing in dark colors and loose-fitting clothes, trying to make myself as invisible as possible. That morning, I pulled out a dress I had bought months earlier but never had the courage to wear, a beautiful royal blue that brought out my eyes, with a flattering cut that actually showed my shape instead of hiding it. As I got ready, I kept reminding myself of the truths I had discovered the day before. I was not an embarrassment. I was not less worthy of love and respect because of my size. I was not a bad Christian because I struggled with weight. I was a child of God, fearfully and wonderfully made, with just as much right to worship and belong as anyone else in that sanctuary. When I arrived at church that morning, I didn't take my usual seat in the back. Instead, I walked confidently down the aisle and sat in the third row from the front, right in the middle section where everyone could see me. I wanted to be visible. I wanted to take up space. I wanted to claim my place in this community that I had served faithfully for 15 years. I could feel eyes on me as I settled in, and I heard whispers from behind me that I chose not to acknowledge. Diane Patterson was sitting in her usual spot about 4 rows back, and I could feel her gaze boring into the back of my head. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care what she or anyone else thought about my appearance. I was there to worship God, not to win anyone's approval. During the opening hymns, I sang louder than I had in years. During the prayer time, I actually raised my hand to request prayer for courage to be the woman God created me to be. When Pastor Williams invited people to share testimonies or prayer requests, I did something I had never done before. I stood up to speak. "I want to share something with my church family," I said, my voice shaking slightly but growing stronger with each word. This week, I was reminded of how easy it is for us to forget that we are all fearfully and wonderfully made in God's image. Sometimes we look at ourselves or others through the world's eyes instead of through God's eyes. Sometimes we let society's standards of beauty and worth become more important than God's standards of love and acceptance. I could see people shifting uncomfortably in their seats, including Diane, who had gone very pale. I continued. "I want to challenge all of us, myself included, to remember that our worth comes from being God's children, not from our dress size or our appearance or anything else the world tries to tell us matters. I want to challenge us to be the kind of church community where everyone feels loved and welcomed exactly as they are." The sanctuary was completely silent except for a few amens from some of the older members who had known me for years. I sat back down, my heart pounding but feeling more alive than I had in months. After the service, something beautiful happened that I hadn't expected. Person after person came up to thank me for what I had shared. Mrs. Henderson, who was struggling with her own body image issues after a recent weight gain following her diabetes diagnosis. Young Jennifer Morrison, who had been battling an eating disorder. Even some of the men, including Deacon Roberts, who told me his wife had been struggling with depression, partly related to her appearance after gaining weight during menopause. But the most meaningful response came from someone I hadn't anticipated. A woman named Grace Williams, who was new to our church and had been sitting near the back, approached me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "I almost didn't come back to church because I was afraid people would judge me for being overweight. Your words today made me feel like maybe I do belong here after all." That's when I realized that my decision to speak up hadn't just been about defending myself, it had been about defending all the women who had ever felt unwelcome in God's house because of their appearance. It had been about creating space for people like Grace, people like my daughter and granddaughter, people like me who had spent too many years believing we had to earn acceptance instead of simply receiving it as our birthright as God's children. As I drove home that morning, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: pride. Not pride in my appearance or my achievements, but pride in my courage. Pride in my decision to stand up and speak truth. Pride in my willingness to take up space and claim my place in the world. But I also knew this was just the beginning. Speaking up once in church was a good first step, but it wasn't going to change the fundamental problems that plus-size women face every day in our society. If I really wanted to make a difference, for myself and for others, I was going to have to do more than just talk about acceptance and love. I was going to have to find ways to actively create the change I wanted to see. The week following my decision to speak up in church was unlike any I had experienced in years. For the first time in decades, I felt like I was living my life instead of just surviving it. The simple act of standing up and claiming my worth had awakened something inside me that I didn't even know was there. A sense of power and possibility that I had buried under years of shame and self-doubt. I started noticing things about myself that I had forgotten or never acknowledged. When I walked into the grocery store that Tuesday, instead of hurrying through the aisles with my head down, trying to avoid eye contact, I found myself making small talk with other shoppers and even smiling at the cashier. When Mrs. Patterson, no relation to Diane, complimented my dress, I actually said thank you instead of deflecting or making a self-deprecating comment about how the color probably made me look bigger. But the real discovery of my inner strength came that Thursday when I had to go to the department store to buy a gift for my great-nephew's birthday. I had been putting off the shopping trip for weeks because I dreaded the experience of being in a store full of clothes that weren't made for bodies like mine, surrounded by images of impossibly thin models and the judgmental stares of salespeople. As I walked through the main entrance, I was immediately confronted with the familiar layout that relegated plus-size clothing to a hidden corner in the back of the store, as if our very existence was something to be ashamed of. But instead of feeling the usual surge of humiliation and anger, I felt something different, a clear-eyed recognition of exactly what was happening and why it was wrong. I decided to conduct a little experiment. Instead of skulking directly to the plus-size section like I usually did, I walked through the main clothing areas, looking at styles and colors that appealed to me. When a young saleswoman approached and asked if she could help me find anything, I said, "Yes, I'd like to see this dress in a size 22. The look on her face was exactly what I expected: surprise, discomfort, and barely concealed disdain. "Oh," she said, "we don't carry that size in our regular department. You'll want to check our plus-size section in the back of the store." "I know where your plus-size section is," I replied calmly. "But I'm wondering why this particular style isn't available in larger sizes. Do you think plus-size women don't like beautiful clothes?" She stammered something about different manufacturers and separate inventory systems, but I could see that my question had never occurred to her before. I wasn't trying to make her uncomfortable. I was trying to make her think. "I've been shopping here for 15 years, I continued, "and I've spent thousands of dollars in your plus-size section. But I've always wondered why I have to go to a separate part of the store, shop from a much smaller selection, and pay higher prices for the same quality of clothing. Can you help me understand the business logic behind that?" By this point, she had called over a manager, a middle-aged woman who was clearly more experienced in dealing with difficult customers. But I wasn't being difficult, I was being curious. I was asking questions that any reasonable customer might ask, and I was asking them politely and with genuine interest in the answers. The manager gave me the standard corporate responses about market segments and different customer needs. But when I pressed her to explain why plus-size women apparently needed lower quality fabrics, fewer style options, and less convenient shopping experiences, she couldn't provide any satisfactory answers. "Ma'am," she finally said, "I understand your concerns, but this is just how the industry works. If you're not satisfied with our plus-size selection, you might want to try shopping online or at stores that specialize in larger sizes." "In other words," I said, still maintaining my pleasant tone, "you'd prefer that I take my money elsewhere rather than address the fact that your store treats a significant portion of the population as second-class customers." I could see other customers beginning to pay attention to our conversation, and I realized that my simple questions were exposing something that usually remained hidden. By refusing to accept the status quo as inevitable or acceptable, I was forcing everyone within earshot to really look at practices they had probably never questioned before. I didn't make a scene. I didn't raise my voice or become confrontational. I simply thanked them for their time, said I would indeed be taking my business elsewhere, and walked out of the store with my head held high. But something profound had happened in that interaction. For the first time in my life, I had refused to accept discrimination as if it were normal or deserved. I had asked questions that made people uncomfortable because they forced them to confront the arbitrary and unfair nature of how plus-size women are treated in retail environments. More importantly, I had discovered that I had power I didn't know. I possessed the power of a customer who refuses to accept poor treatment, the power of a woman who won't be shamed into silence, the power of a person who understands that asking reasonable questions can expose unreasonable practices. That evening, I sat down at my computer and did something I had never done before. I wrote a detailed letter to the corporate headquarters of that department store chain, describing my experience and asking them to explain their policies regarding plus-size customers. I didn't write it in anger or with the expectation that it would change anything immediately. I wrote it because I had discovered that I had a voice, and I was finally ready to use it. Emboldened by my experience at the department store, I began to look for other opportunities to practice this new skill I was developing. The ability to advocate for myself and, by extension, for other plus-size women who might not yet have found their own voices. It was as if I had been sleepwalking through decades of discrimination and had suddenly woken up to realize that I didn't have to accept poor treatment just because it was common. The very next week, I had a doctor's appointment for my annual physical, something I had been dreading for months because of past experiences with medical professionals who seemed to think that every health issue could be solved by losing weight. Dr. Martinez had been my physician for about 3 years, and while he wasn't intentionally cruel like some doctors I had encountered, he had a tendency to focus exclusively on my weight during every visit, regardless of why I was there. This time, I decided to take control of the conversation from the beginning. When he walked into the examination room and immediately began discussing my weight and the need to get serious about losing it, I politely interrupted him. "Dr. Martinez," I said, "I understand that you're concerned about my weight, and I appreciate that concern. But before we discuss that, I'd like to talk about the reason I made this appointment. I've been having some issues with joint pain in my knees, and I'd like to have that evaluated properly." He seemed taken aback by my directness, but he nodded and began asking questions about the knee pain. However, within 5 minutes, he was back to talking about weight loss as the primary solution. "The extra weight you're carrying is definitely contributing to the stress on your joints," he said. "If you could lose 50 or 60 pounds, you'd probably see significant improvement." "That may be true," I replied, "but what I'm asking for right now is an evaluation of my current symptoms and available treatment options that don't require me to lose a significant amount of weight as a prerequisite. I'd also like to discuss the possibility of physical therapy, joint supplements, or other interventions that might help me maintain my mobility and quality of life while I'm working on my overall health." This was revolutionary for me. In the past, I would have simply nodded along with whatever the doctor said, accepted his weight loss prescription as the only valid treatment option, and left feeling ashamed and hopeless. But now, I was advocating for comprehensive medical care that addressed my immediate needs rather than deferring all treatment until I achieved some arbitrary weight goal. Dr. Martinez actually paused and really looked at me, perhaps seeing me as a whole person with legitimate medical needs rather than just a number on a scale that needed to be reduced. We ended up having a much more productive conversation about pain management, inflammation reduction, and lifestyle modifications that could help with my joint issues regardless of my weight. But the real breakthrough came when he started to give me his standard lecture about diet and exercise. "Doctor," I said, interrupting him gently but firmly, "I need to share something with you. I've been dieting for over 40 years. I've tried every weight loss program you could name, and some you probably couldn't. I've lost hundreds of pounds over the years, and I've gained it all back plus more. What I've learned is that the constant cycle of dieting and weight regain has actually made me less healthy, not more healthy." I could see him preparing to argue, but I continued. "What I'm asking from you as my healthcare provider is support for sustainable lifestyle changes that improve my overall health and quality of life, regardless of whether they result in dramatic weight loss. I'm asking for medical care that treats Me as a whole person with complex health needs, not just a weight problem that needs to be solved. For the first time in any doctor's visit I could remember, I felt like I was being heard. Dr. Martinez actually apologized for his approach and asked me what kind of support I felt would be most helpful. We developed a plan that included physical, therapy for my knees, nutritional counseling focused on overall health rather than weight loss, and regular check-ins to monitor my progress in multiple areas, not just the number on the scale. Walking out of that appointment, I felt like I had just completed a masterclass in self-advocacy. I had refused to accept inadequate medical care. I had educated my doctor about the reality of long-term dieting, and I had negotiated for treatment that addressed my actual needs rather than his assumptions about what my needs should be. But my newfound confidence didn't stop there. Later that same week, I had an experience at my local restaurant that would have been devastating to the old Margaret, but became an opportunity for the new one to practice standing up for herself. I had met my neighbor Dorothy for our monthly lunch at Cracker Barrel, something we had been doing for almost 2 years. We were seated at a booth, and I was settling in when I realized that the booth was designed in such a way that I couldn't fit comfortably. The space between the table and the bench was too narrow, and the table itself couldn't be moved. In the past, I would have squeezed myself in painfully, spent the entire meal uncomfortable and embarrassed, and probably never returned to that restaurant. But this time, I calmly flagged down our waitress. "Excuse me," I said politely. "This booth isn't going to work for me. Could we please be seated at a table instead?" The waitress looked confused. "Is there something wrong with the booth?" "It's not designed to accommodate someone of my size comfortably," I explained matter-of-factly. "I'd prefer a table where I can sit comfortably and enjoy my meal." Instead of the argument or embarrassment I expected, the waitress simply said, "Of course. Let me find you a nice table." Within minutes, we were seated at a spacious table where I could sit comfortably. Dorothy, who had watched this interaction with obvious admiration, said something that stayed with me for weeks afterward. "Margaret," she said, "I've been watching you change over the past few weeks, and I have to say, I'm inspired. You're not apologizing for your needs anymore. You're not shrinking yourself to make other people comfortable. You're just standing up for yourself like you have every right to do." That's when I realized that my transformation was visible to others, not just to me. I was carrying myself differently, speaking up more confidently, and refusing to accept treatment that was beneath my dignity as a human being. And apparently, it was inspiring other people to think about their own self-advocacy skills. The letter I had written to the department store corporate headquarters received a response 3 weeks later. Not just a form letter, but a detailed response from a regional manager who wanted to schedule a phone conversation to discuss my concerns. They were actually interested in hearing about my experience and exploring ways to improve their services for plus-size customers. I was beginning to understand that individual acts of self-advocacy could add up to something much bigger, systemic, change that benefits not just me, but everyone who has ever felt marginalized or discriminated against because of their appearance. As word began to spread about my transformation, apparently small towns really don't have any secrets, I found myself facing new challenges that tested my newfound confidence in unexpected ways. Some of these challenges came from people who were uncomfortable with the new Margaret, who preferred the quiet, accommodating woman who never caused waves or made anyone think too hard about their own behavior. The first major test came about a month after my conversation with Dr. Martinez, when I received a phone call from the president of our church's board of directors, Harold Mitchell. Harold was a man in his 70s who had been a pillar of our church for decades, and he had always treated me with respect and kindness, so when he asked if he could stop by my house for a chat, I assumed it was about church business, or perhaps a request for me to take on some new volunteer responsibility. I was completely unprepared for what he actually wanted to discuss. "Margaret," he said, settling into my living room chair with obvious discomfort, "I've been hearing some concerns from church members about your recent behavior during services." My heart sank, but I kept my expression neutral. "What kind of concerns, Harold?" "Well," he said, clearly struggling with how to phrase his words, "some folks feel like you've been a bit confrontational lately. The things you said during testimony time a few weeks ago made some people uncomfortable. And I've heard that you've been asking a lot of questions about church policies and procedures." I had indeed been asking questions about why our church directory didn't include photos of plus-size members, about why our women's ministry seemed to focus so heavily on topics like biblical womanhood, that often included subtle messages about appearance and body image, about why our church had never addressed issues of acceptance and inclusion from the pulpit. "Harold," I said carefully, "can you be more specific about what was confrontational about my testimony? I shared my experience about learning to see myself the way God sees me, and I encouraged others to examine whether we're treating all people with the love and acceptance that Christ calls us to show." "Well, yes," he said, "but some people felt like you were criticizing the church, like you were suggesting that we're not loving or accepting enough." "Are we?" I asked quietly. The question hung in the air between us for a long moment. Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and I could see him wrestling with how to respond. "Margaret," he finally said, "you've been a valued member of this church for 15 years. You've served faithfully in so many capacities. No one questions your heart or your commitment to this congregation, but some people feel like you're stirring up trouble where there wasn't trouble before." "Harold," I said, leaning forward slightly, "let me ask you something. If I told you that I've been attending this church for 15 years and that 3 weeks ago I experienced cruel mockery about my body during a Bible study meeting, would you consider that trouble?" His face went pale. "What are you talking about?" I told him about Diane Patterson's comments, about the years of subtle discrimination I had experienced, about the way plus-size women in our congregation were often made to feel unwelcome or ashamed. I told him about the young woman who had thanked me for speaking up because she had almost stopped coming to church due to feeling judged about her appearance. "Are you saying," Harold asked slowly, "that this has been going on for years and nobody told me?" "I'm saying that this has been going on for years and the people it was happening to didn't feel safe speaking up about it. I'm saying that when marginalized people finally find their voices, it can feel like trouble to people who were comfortable with the status quo." We talked for 2 hours that afternoon. Harold listened as I shared story after story of plus-size women in our congregation who had felt unwelcome, judged, or excluded. He was genuinely shocked to learn about experiences that had been invisible to him, not because he was uncaring, but because they had been invisible to most people who weren't experiencing them directly. By the end of our conversation, Harold wasn't asking me to tone down my advocacy. He was asking me to help the church leadership understand how to address these issues more effectively. "Margaret," he said as he was leaving, "I owe you an apology. I came here thinking you were causing problems, but I'm leaving understanding that you're helping us see problems that were already there. Would you be willing to speak to the board about these issues?" That invitation led to one of the most challenging but rewarding experiences of my new journey. 2 weeks later, I found myself sitting in front of the church board, 7 men and 2 women, most of whom had never really thought about issues of body image, weight discrimination, or inclusive church culture. I had prepared extensively for this meeting, not just with stories and examples, but with concrete suggestions for changes the church could make to become more welcoming to people of all sizes. I talked about the need for diverse representation in church leadership and imagery, about the importance of addressing body image and self-worth from the pulpit, about creating support groups for people struggling with these issues. Some board members were immediately receptive, others were defensive. One man actually suggested that maybe some people are just too sensitive and that the church shouldn't have to change to accommodate every individual complaint. That's when I had my biggest test yet. In the past, I would have backed down, apologized for bringing up difficult topics, and tried to smooth over any conflict. But I had come too far to retreat now. "Brother Johnson," I said, looking directly at the man who had made that comment, "I need to respectfully disagree with you. We're not talking about accommodating individual complaints. We're talking about creating a church culture that reflects the radical love and acceptance that Jesus demonstrated in his ministry. We're talking about ensuring that every person who walks through our doors feels valued and welcomed as a beloved child of God." I paused for a moment, then continued. "If you had a daughter or granddaughter who stopped coming to church because she felt judged and unwelcome here, would you tell her she was being too sensitive? Or would you want the church to examine its practices and make changes to ensure she felt loved and accepted?" The room was completely silent. I could see people processing not just my words, but the implications of what I was asking them to consider. If you believe that obese women can achieve anything, subscribe to the channel and share this video with a friend who needs to be empowered. As my second year of advocacy work began, I found myself facing opportunities that would have been unimaginable. To the woman who had sat in that church pew feeling ashamed and diminished by Diane Patterson's cruel words. The work I had been doing locally was gaining attention on a national level, and I was being invited to participate in conversations and initiatives that could impact policy and practice far beyond my small Tennessee community. The first major opportunity came from the Association for Size Diversity and Health, a national organization that promotes weight-neutral approaches to health and wellness. They invited me to serve on their board of directors and to help develop training materials for healthcare providers across the country. This role required me to travel to conferences and meetings in cities I had never visited, to collaborate with researchers and activists whose work I had been following online, and to contribute to policy discussions that would affect millions of people. The imposter syndrome was real. Here I was, a 68-year-old woman from small-town Tennessee, sitting at tables with PhD researchers and nationally recognized experts. But I quickly learned that my lived experience and practical advocacy skills were exactly what these conversations needed. While the researchers could provide data and evidence, I could translate that information into concrete strategies for change that would resonate with ordinary people and community organizations. My first major project with the organization was developing a toolkit for faith communities that wanted to address weight stigma and promote body acceptance. Drawing on my experience at Riverside Community Church and the satellite groups we had established, I created resources that included sermon guides for pastors, curriculum for small groups, and practical suggestions for making church facilities and programs more inclusive. The response to this toolkit exceeded everyone's expectations. Within 6 months of its release, it had been downloaded by over 2,000 faith communities across the United States and Canada. I began receiving invitations to speak at denominational conferences and seminary events, helping to train the next generation of religious leaders to create more inclusive congregations. But perhaps the most significant opportunity came when I was asked to testify before a congressional subcommittee that was examining discrimination in healthcare settings. The invitation came through my work with the Tennessee Department of Health Task Force, and it represented a chance to influence federal policy on issues I had been working on at the local level. Preparing for this testimony required weeks of research and preparation. I worked with policy experts to understand the legislative landscape and to frame my recommendations in ways that would be compelling to lawmakers from both political parties. I also gathered stories from people across the country who had experienced weight discrimination in healthcare settings, using their voices to illustrate the human impact of the policies we were discussing. The day of the hearing was both terrifying and exhilarating. Sitting at the witness table in a congressional hearing room, looking out at the representatives who would be questioning me, I thought about how far I had traveled from that evening in church when I had felt so small and powerless when it was my turn to speak. I shared my own story of experiencing weight bias in medical settings, but I also presented data about the health and economic consequences of discrimination in healthcare. I talked about the research showing that weight stigma actually worsens health outcomes and increases healthcare costs, making it not just a moral issue, but a practical policy concern. Honorable members of the committee, I concluded, what we're discussing today isn't about political correctness or special treatment for any particular group. We're talking about ensuring that all Americans have access to respectful, evidence-based health care that helps them achieve their best possible health outcomes. The research is clear that discrimination in healthcare settings harms patients and wastes healthcare resources. We have an opportunity to address these problems through policy changes that will benefit everyone. The questions that followed were challenging but respectful, and I left the hearing feeling like I had effectively represented not just my own experiences, but the experiences of millions of people who had faced similar discrimination. Several months later, I learned that the committee's recommendations, which included many of the policies I had advocated for, had been incorporated into a broader healthcare reform bill that was moving through Congress. Meanwhile, my consulting work was expanding into new areas. I was invited to work with airlines on making air travel more accessible for passengers of all sizes, with hospitality companies on creating inclusive accommodations and services, and with technology companies on developing apps and platforms that promoted body positivity rather than weight obsession. Each of these projects taught me something new about the pervasive nature of size discrimination and the creative solutions that were possible when organizations committed to meaningful change. I was learning that inclusion wasn't just about being nice or politically correct. It was about good business practices, better customer service, and more effective outcomes across virtually every industry and sector. The airline project was particularly meaningful to me, given my own painful experiences with air travel over the years. Working with a major carrier, I helped develop new policies for seat assignments, customer service training that addressed size-related concerns with dignity and respect, and modifications to aircraft design that made flying more comfortable for passengers of all sizes. When the airline announced these changes, I received hundreds of emails from travelers thanking me for work that would make their journeys less stressful and humiliating. Many of these messages came from people who had avoided flying altogether because of past negative experiences, but who were now willing to travel again because they felt confident they would be treated with respect. But perhaps the most rewarding aspect of this expanding work was the opportunity it gave me to mentor other advocates who were beginning their own journeys toward activism and change. I began receiving requests from people across the country who wanted advice on how to start support groups, how to approach businesses about inclusive practices, and how to find their own voices in advocacy work. I established a mentorship program that paired experienced advocates with newcomers, created online resources and training materials, and organized annual conferences where people could share strategies, celebrate successes, and support each other through the challenges of advocacy work. One of my most successful mentees was a young woman named Jessica who had started a body-positive fitness program in her community after experiencing discrimination at traditional gyms. Under my guidance, she had expanded her program into a franchise model that was operating in 12 cities within 2 years. Another mentee, David, was a healthcare provider who had recognized weight bias in his own practice and wanted to create change within the medical profession. He developed a continuing education program for physicians that became a model for medical schools across the country. Watching these advocates develop their own expertise and leadership skills reminded me daily that the work I had started was much bigger than any individual contribution. I was part of a movement that was creating lasting, systemic change that would benefit generations of people who deserved to live free from discrimination and shame. As I reflected on how much my life had changed in just 2 years, I realized that the cruel words that had once devastated me had actually been the catalyst for discovering my true purpose and potential. The woman who had mocked me in church had unknowingly set in motion a series of events that would impact thousands of lives and help create a more just and inclusive society. By my third year of advocacy work, I thought I had faced every type of challenge and opposition that was possible in this field. I had dealt with skeptical business leaders, resistant healthcare providers, and defensive church members. I had navigated complex policy discussions, managed difficult personalities, and overcome my own fears and insecurities about stepping into leadership roles. But nothing had prepared me for the obstacle that emerged in the fall of that year. A coordinated campaign to discredit my work and undermine the progress we had been making in our community and beyond. It started with anonymous flyers that appeared on car windshields throughout our town, featuring my photo alongside text that accused me of promoting obesity and encouraging unhealthy lifestyles. The flyers claimed that my advocacy work was contributing to the obesity epidemic and that I was profiting from keeping people fat and sick. Within days, these same accusations appeared on social media, amplified by accounts that seemed designed specifically to spread disinformation about body positivity and size acceptance movements. My personal information was shared online, leading to harassing phone calls and emails that ranged from cruel mockery to explicit threats. The attacks weren't just personal. They targeted the organizations I worked with, the businesses that had implemented inclusive practices based on my recommendations, and even the people who attended our support groups. Several group members received messages questioning their decision to follow a fat activist who doesn't care about health. The most painful aspect of this campaign was that it divided our own community. People who had supported my work began to question whether I was really helping people or just making them feel better about being unhealthy. Some church members suggested that maybe I had gone too far, that I was promoting acceptance of sin rather than encouraging people to take care of their bodies. Even some of my closest allies began to waver. Harold Mitchell, the church board president, who had become one of my strongest supporters, called to ask if we should take a step back from some of our programming until the controversy died down. "Margaret," he said during a tense phone conversation, "I believe in the work you're doing, but some of these accusations are making people really uncomfortable. Maybe we should focus more on general self-esteem and less on specifically defending being overweight." This was the moment when I had to decide whether I would retreat in the face of opposition or double down on the principles and evidence that had guided my work from the beginning. It would have been easier to soften my message, to focus on less controversial aspects of body acceptance, to try to appease the critics by distancing myself from anything that could be perceived as promoting obesity. But I had learned too much and come too far to abandon the truth now. I spent weeks researching the sources of the disinformation campaign and discovered that much of it was being funded by weight loss companies and diet industry organizations that saw the body positivity movement as a threat to their profits. I also reached out to researchers and medical professionals whose work I had been following, asking them to help me respond to the accusations with facts and evidence. What I learned was that every single claim being made against me and my work was contradicted by peer-reviewed research and established medical knowledge. The accusation that I was promoting obesity was particularly frustrating because it revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what body positivity actually means. I had never encouraged anyone to gain weight or ignore health problems. What I had consistently advocated for was treating people with respect, regardless of their size, focusing on health behaviors rather than weight outcomes, and recognizing that shame and discrimination actually worsen health outcomes rather than improving them. I decided to respond to the campaign not by defending myself against false accusations, but by educating the community about the real issues at stake. I organized a town hall meeting at our church, inviting medical professionals, researchers, and community members to discuss the difference between promoting health and promoting discrimination. The meeting was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the fellowship hall where we had set up overflow seating with live video. I was nervous about how it would go. This was the most public platform I had ever had for addressing these issues, and I knew that many people in the audience were skeptical or even hostile to my message. I started by acknowledging the concerns that had been raised and expressing my appreciation for everyone who had come to learn and discuss these important issues. Then I spent 45 minutes presenting the research on weight stigma, health outcomes, and the effectiveness of different approaches to promoting wellness. The question before us tonight, I said, isn't whether we should care about health. Of course we should. The question is whether shame, discrimination, and weight stigma are effective tools for promoting health, or whether they actually make health outcomes worse. I presented study after study showing that weight stigma leads to stress, depression, disordered eating, and avoidance of health care, all of which worsen health outcomes regardless of a person's weight. I showed evidence that weight-neutral approaches to health promotion are more effective than weight-focused approaches at improving both physical and mental health. But more importantly, I talked about the human cost of discrimination and the moral obligation. We have to treat all people with dignity and respect. Even if being fat were inherently unhealthy, I said, which the research suggests is much more complicated than most people believe, that still wouldn't justify treating fat people cruelly or denying them equal access to employment, health care, or social acceptance. We don't shame people with other health conditions, and we shouldn't shame people based on their weight. The discussion that followed was heated at times, but it was also productive. Several healthcare providers in the audience spoke about their own observations that patients who felt respected and supported were more likely to engage in healthy behaviors than patients who felt judged and shamed. Parents talked about their concerns regarding how to promote healthy habits in their children without contributing to body image problems. Business owners asked practical questions about how to implement inclusive practices without alienating customers who might disagree with these approaches. By the end of the evening, the tone in the room had shifted significantly. People were asking thoughtful questions instead of making accusations. Former skeptics were acknowledging that they had learned things they hadn't known before. Several people who had been spreading the disinformation campaign publicly apologized and committed to learning more before sharing information in the future. But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Martinez, my own physician, stood up to speak. "I want to publicly thank Margaret Thompson," he said, "for challenging me to become a better doctor. The approaches she advocated for haven't just improved my relationships with plus-size patients. They've made me more effective at helping all of my patients achieve better health outcomes. The research she shared with me has made me a better physician, and our community is healthier because of the work she's doing." The disinformation campaign didn't end that night, but it lost most of its power in our community. People had heard the facts directly from credible sources, and they had seen me respond to attacks with education rather than defensiveness or anger. More importantly, the experience taught me that opposition and obstacles were often signs that the work was having real impact. The diet industry wouldn't have spent money trying to discredit me if they didn't see body positivity as a genuine threat to their profits. The intensity of the backlash was actually evidence that we were succeeding in changing hearts, minds, and systems. If this empowerment story touched your soul, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, share with someone special, and write in the comments which city and country you're watching from. The real turning point in my journey came in an unexpected way during what initially seemed like one of the darkest moments of the entire experience. About 6 months after the disinformation campaign, I received news that would test everything I had learned about resilience, purpose, and the power of community. I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. When Dr. Martinez called with the test results, my first emotion wasn't fear or sadness, it was shame. Despite everything I had learned about health, weight, and self-worth, my immediate thought was that somehow I had failed, that the critics had been right, that my advocacy for body acceptance had been misguided. "I know what you're thinking," Dr. Martinez said during our follow-up appointment, "and I want you to stop right there. This diagnosis doesn't invalidate anything you've taught me or our community. Diabetes is a complex condition with multiple contributing factors, including genetics, age, stress, and yes, sometimes weight. But it's also a manageable condition, and we're going to manage it together using the same respectful, patient-centered approach you helped me learn. His words were comforting, but I still struggled with the fear that this diagnosis would be used to discredit my work and prove that body positivity was just denial of health problems. I imagined the critics saying, "See, we told you she was promoting unhealthy lifestyles, and now she's sick because of it." But something remarkable happened instead. When word of my diagnosis spread through our community, and I was open about it because I believed transparency was important, the response was overwhelmingly supportive. More importantly, it became an opportunity to demonstrate exactly what health-centered, weight-neutral care looked like in practice. Instead of Dr. Martinez immediately prescribing a weight loss diet and exercise regimen, we worked together to develop a comprehensive diabetes management plan that focused on blood sugar control, stress reduction, medication management, and sustainable lifestyle changes that I could maintain long-term. We talked about nutrition in terms of blood sugar stability rather than calorie restriction. We discussed movement in terms of what activities I enjoyed and could realistically incorporate into my life rather than punitive exercise routines designed primarily for weight loss. We addressed the stress factors in my life, including the demands of my advocacy work, and made adjustments to help me maintain better work-life balance. Most importantly, we monitored my health using indicators that actually mattered: blood sugar levels, blood pressure, energy levels, mood, and overall quality of life, rather than focusing primarily on what the scale said. The results were better than either of us had expected. Within 3 months, my blood sugar levels were well controlled. My energy had improved significantly, and I felt better than I had in years. I had achieved these health improvements without losing significant amounts of weight, which proved the point I had been making all along: that health and weight are not as directly connected as most people believe. But more importantly, my experience became a powerful teaching tool for demonstrating what respectful, evidence-based healthcare looked like. I began sharing my story in healthcare settings, showing providers how they could help patients with diabetes and other conditions achieve better health outcomes by focusing on sustainable behavior changes rather than weight loss. The diabetes diagnosis also led to one of the most meaningful projects of my advocacy career. I partnered with the American Diabetes Association to develop educational materials and support groups specifically for plus-size people with diabetes who had experienced weight stigma in medical settings. Many people with diabetes, especially those who are overweight, receive medical care that focuses almost exclusively on weight loss as the primary treatment strategy. This approach often leads to poor health outcomes because it ignores other important aspects of diabetes management and can create additional stress and shame that actually worsen blood sugar control. Our program, called Diabetes Without Shame, provided education about weight-neutral diabetes management, support for people who had experienced medical discrimination, and advocacy training for patients who wanted to work with their healthcare providers to develop more respectful and effective treatment plans. The response to this program was overwhelming. We received requests to implement it in hospitals and clinics across the country, and it became a model for similar programs addressing other health conditions. But perhaps the most powerful aspect of this entire experience was how it demonstrated the strength of the community we had built over the previous 3 years. When I was going through the emotional challenges of the diagnosis and the process of learning to manage a chronic condition, I was surrounded by people who had learned from my advocacy work and were now able to support me in return. Grace Williams, who had once been afraid to attend church because of her size, became one of my strongest supporters during this period. She had started her own support group in a neighboring town and had developed into a confident advocate in her own right. "Margaret," she said during one of our phone conversations, "you taught me that my worth isn't determined by my health status or my weight. Now I want to remind you of the same thing. You are valuable and important because of who you are, not because of any medical diagnosis or number on a scale. Jennifer, the young mother who had been struggling with eating disorders when she first joined our support group, had become a certified nutritional counselor specializing in eating disorder recovery. She helped me navigate the emotional aspects of changing my relationship with food in the context of diabetes management without falling back into diet mentality. Even Diane Patterson, who had become one of our most dedicated volunteers, stepped up during this period to help coordinate support group activities when I needed to reduce my workload temporarily. Watching this community of people who had found their own strength and voice through our work come together to support me was profoundly moving. It showed me that the most important impact of my advocacy wasn't the policy changes or business transformations, significant as those were. It was the way it had empowered other people to become advocates and leaders in their own right. Diabetes diagnosis, which I had initially feared would undermine my credibility and effectiveness, actually strengthened my work in unexpected ways. It demonstrated that health advocacy isn't about being perfectly healthy or conforming to societal expectations about what healthy people look like. It's about creating systems and communities that support everyone in achieving their best possible health and quality of life. More importantly, it showed me that the transformation I had undergone over the previous 3 years was complete and irreversible. I no longer defined my worth by my health status, my weight, or other people's opinions about my body. I had become someone who could face challenges with confidence, who could turn obstacles into opportunities, and who understood that my value as a human being was unconditional and unshakable. The woman who had once sat in a church pew feeling humiliated and powerless had been replaced by someone who could face a chronic illness diagnosis with equanimity, who could turn personal health challenges into opportunities to help others, and who understood that true strength comes from accepting yourself exactly as you are while working toward becoming the best version of yourself possible. 3&D. A half years after that devastating evening at church, I found myself standing in the White House Rose Garden, preparing to witness the signing of the Healthcare Equality Act, legislation that included anti-discrimination provisions I had helped develop through my testimony and advocacy work. The journey from that moment of humiliation to this moment of triumph still felt surreal. As I watched the president sign the bill that would protect millions of Americans from weight-based discrimination in healthcare settings, I thought about all the people whose stories had contributed to this moment, the patients who had shared their experiences of medical discrimination, the healthcare providers who had committed to change, the advocates who had worked tirelessly to build support for this legislation. But I also thought about Diane Patterson, who was watching the signing ceremony on television back home in Tennessee, and about the unexpected ways that cruelty can sometimes be transformed into justice when met with determination and love. The Healthcare Equality Act was just one of many policy victories that had emerged from the movement we had helped build. At the state level, Tennessee had become a national model for inclusive healthcare practices, with hospitals and clinics across the state implementing weight-neutral care protocols that were improving health outcomes for patients of all sizes. The business sector had seen equally dramatic changes. The retail consulting work I had started with that one department store had expanded into a full-scale movement toward inclusive business practices. Over 50 major retailers had implemented comprehensive accessibility and inclusion programs, creating more welcoming environments for customers of all sizes and generating significant increases in both customer satisfaction and revenue. The airline industry had been transformed as well. The policies I had helped develop were now standard practice across most major carriers, and air travel had become significantly more comfortable and dignified for passengers of all sizes. The changes had been so successful that they had become selling points for airlines, with companies advertising their inclusive policies as competitive advantages. But perhaps the most meaningful achievements had been in the realm of healthcare. The weight-neutral diabetes management program we had developed was now being used in over 200 hospitals nationwide, and similar programs had been created for other chronic conditions. Medical schools were incorporating courses on weight bias and inclusive care into their curricula, training the next generation of healthcare providers to treat all patients with respect and dignity. The research that had emerged from these programs was providing compelling evidence that respectful, weight-neutral healthcare approaches produced better health outcomes than traditional weight-focused methods. Patient satisfaction scores had improved, treatment compliance had increased, and health indicators had shown significant improvement across all patient populations. My work had also gained international recognition. I had been invited to speak at conferences in Canada, the United Kingdom, and Australia, helping other countries develop their own approaches to addressing weight discrimination and promoting inclusive health care. The toolkit I had developed for faith communities had been translated into 4 languages and was being used by religious organizations around the world. The speaking engagements and consulting work had evolved into something I never could have imagined. I had become a sought-after expert on inclusion, discrimination, and systemic change. Universities were inviting me to guest lecture in courses on public health, social justice, and organizational behavior. Corporate leadership teams were bringing me in to help them understand how inclusive practices could improve their business, outcomes, and workplace cultures. But the achievement that gave me the most pride was the network of advocates and leaders who had emerged from our original support group and its satellite programs. What had started as a small circle of people dealing with body image issues had grown into a national movement with local leaders in hundreds of communities across the country. Jessica, my former mentee who had started the Body Positive Fitness program, had expanded her work into a national franchise with locations in over 30 cities. Her programs were providing safe, inclusive fitness opportunities for thousands of people who had previously felt unwelcome in traditional gym environments. David, the healthcare provider who had recognized bias in his own practice, had become a national leader in medical education reform. He had developed training programs that were now required in medical schools across the country, and his research on the health impacts of weight stigma had been published in major medical journals. Grace Williams had become a regional coordinator for our support group network, helping to establish and train leaders for new groups throughout the Southeast. Her own transformation from someone who was afraid to attend church to someone who was empowering others in multiple communities was a testament to the ripple effects of advocacy work. Even more gratifying was the impact our work was having on young people. The anti-bullying curricula we had developed were being used in schools nationwide, and we were seeing measurable reductions in weight-based harassment and improvements in body image among students. Young people who had participated in our programs were going on to become advocates and leaders in their own right, ensuring that the movement would continue beyond my own involvement. The financial impact of my work had been substantial as well, though that had never been my primary motivation. The consulting work, speaking engagements, and book deals that had emerged from my advocacy had provided me with financial security I had never expected. More importantly, it had allowed me to establish a foundation that provided grants to grassroots advocates and organizations working on inclusion and anti-discrimination initiatives. But perhaps the most extraordinary achievement was simply the fact that I had survived and thrived after experiencing the kind of public humiliation that might have destroyed someone else. I had not only recovered from that devastating moment in church, I had used it as the foundation for building a life of purpose, meaning, and impact that exceeded anything I had ever imagined possible. The woman who had once apologized for taking up space was now confidently claiming her place on national stages, in policy discussions, and in conversations that would shape the future for millions of people. The woman who had once believed that her worth was determined by her appearance had become someone who understood that her true value lay in her ability to see injustice, speak truth, and create change. But most importantly, I had learned that transformation isn't just about personal growth. It's about using your own healing and empowerment to help heal and empower others. The most extraordinary achievement wasn't any individual recognition or policy victory, but the knowledge that countless people were living freer, more confident, more authentic lives because we had refused to accept discrimination as inevitable or deserved. Standing in that rose garden, surrounded by other advocates who had worked to make this moment possible, I realized that the cruelty I had experienced 3.5 years earlier had been transformed into something beautiful and powerful. Diane Patterson's words, intended to diminish and shame me, had instead become the catalyst for a movement that was creating a more just and inclusive world. The recognition that followed the Healthcare Equality Act signing was both overwhelming and humbling. Within weeks, I was featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of their People Who Changed America, alongside other advocates and activists whose work had led to significant social and policy transformations. The article, titled The Unexpected, Revolutionary, traced my journey from that devastating evening at church to my role in transforming healthcare policy and business practices across the country. But what moved me most about the piece was how it focused not just on my individual story, but on the movement we had built and the thousands of people who had found their own voices through our work. Margaret Thompson represents something uniquely American, the article concluded. The idea that any person, regardless of their background or circumstances, can identify an injustice, organize their community, and create change that reverberates far beyond their own experience. Her story reminds us that the most powerful revolutions often begin not with grand manifestos, but with simple human dignity and the courage to demand better. The magazine cover led to a flood of additional recognition that I was still learning to navigate. The American Public Health Association presented me with their highest honor for advocacy work. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People invited me to speak at their annual convention about the intersections between weight discrimination and racial justice. Harvard University offered me a visiting fellowship to research and teach about discrimination and social change. But perhaps the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. The town of Riverside, Tennessee, officially proclaimed Margaret Thompson Day and established a scholarship fund in my name for young people pursuing careers in advocacy, social justice, or inclusive health care. At the ceremony establishing the scholarship, I was introduced by someone I hadn't expected to see, my granddaughter Emma, now 18 and about to start college, who had driven down from Kentucky with my daughter Sarah to surprise me. My grandmother, Emma said, addressing the crowd gathered in the town square, taught me the most important lesson of my life without ever meaning to. She taught me that the things people say to hurt you can become the fuel for changing the world. She taught me that being different isn't something to apologize for. It's something to celebrate and protect in others. Emma went on to announce that she had chosen to major in public health and policy, with the goal of continuing the advocacy work I had started. Hearing her speak with such confidence and purpose, I realized that one of the most important impacts of my transformation had been the example it set for the young women in my family. I used to be afraid of taking up space, she continued, because I inherited the same body type and the same insecurities that plagued the women in our family for generations. But watching my grandmother transform pain into purpose taught me that I don't have to make myself smaller to make other people comfortable. I can use my voice, my intelligence, and even my struggles to make the world better for other people. The scholarship fund that was established that day would eventually provide educational opportunities for dozens of young advocates, many of whom went on to become leaders in their own communities and causes. But for me, the most significant outcome was seeing my granddaughter embrace her own power and potential in ways that previous generations of women in our family never could. The speaking requests that followed the Time magazine feature took me to venues I had never imagined. Addressing, I spoke at the United Nations about the global impact of weight discrimination and the economic benefits of inclusive policies. I addressed the World Health Organization about the need for weight-neutral approaches to public health. I was invited to present my work at the Davos World Economic Forum, where business leaders and government officials from around the world were exploring the connections between inclusion, innovation, and economic growth. Each of these platforms allowed me to share not just my personal story, but the research and evidence that had emerged from our movement. We now had data showing that inclusive business practices increased customer loyalty and revenue, that weight-neutral healthcare approaches improved health outcomes and reduced costs, and that anti-discrimination policies created more productive and innovative workplace cultures. But perhaps the most important aspect of this recognition was how it amplified the voices and work of other advocates in our movement. I used every speaking opportunity to highlight the contributions of the grassroots, leaders, researchers, and activists who had made our successes possible. I insisted that conference organizers include other speakers from our network, and I used my platform to direct funding and resources to local organizations that were doing the actual work of creating change in their communities. The book deal that emerged from this recognition allowed me to tell our story in more depth and to provide practical resources for people who wanted to start their own advocacy efforts. Taking Up Space, A Journey from Shame to Social Change, became a bestseller, but more importantly, it became a guide that was being used by advocacy groups, support organizations, and individuals around the world. The book tour took me to cities across the country, where I met with local advocates, visited support groups that had been inspired by our work, and saw firsthand how the movement had adapted to different communities and contexts. Each stop reinforced my understanding that real change happens at the local level, through the courage of ordinary people who decide to demand better treatment for themselves and others. But the recognition that meant the most to me came from the people whose lives had been directly impacted by our work. I received thousands of letters and emails from individuals who shared how our advocacy had changed their experiences in healthcare settings, helped them find confidence in professional environments, or simply given them permission to love themselves as they were. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman named Maria in California who wrote, "5 years ago, I was contemplating suicide because I couldn't bear the shame of living in a fat body in a world that treated me like I was disgusting and worthless. Today, I'm completing my PhD in public health and preparing to start my own nonprofit organization, serving plus-size women in my community. Your story gave me hope when I had none, and your work gave me tools to transform my pain into purpose." Reading letters like Maria's reminded me that the recognition and accolades, while gratifying, were not the real measure of success. The real measure was the number of people who were living freer, more confident, more authentic lives because we had created a movement that challenged discrimination and promoted dignity for all people. I had become a role model not because I was perfect or had achieved some ideal standard of success, but because I had demonstrated that it was possible to transform devastating experiences into powerful forces for positive change. I had shown that ordinary people could create extraordinary impact when they found the courage to speak truth and demand justice. Most importantly, I had helped create a movement that was bigger than any individual leader or story. The work would continue long after I was gone, carried forward by the thousands of advocates who had found their own voices and power through our shared efforts to create a more inclusive and just world. 5 years after that life-changing moment at church, I barely recognized the woman I had become. Standing in my home office, surrounded by awards, photos from speaking engagements, and letters from people whose lives had been touched by our movement, I marveled at the complete transformation that had taken place. Not just in my external circumstances, but in my fundamental understanding of myself and my place in the world. The physical changes were obvious to anyone who had known me before. I carried myself with a confidence that was visible from across a room. I dressed in colors and styles that I loved, regardless of whether they made me look smaller or more acceptable. I took up space unapologetically, whether I was sitting at a conference table with corporate executives or walking down the aisle of my church. But the internal transformation was even more profound. The woman who had once believed that her worth was determined by her appearance now understood that her value came from her character, her contributions, and her inherent dignity as a human being. The woman who had once apologized for existing now spoke with authority at national conferences and policy meetings. Perhaps most remarkably, I had developed what I called unshakable self-worth, a sense of personal value that couldn't be diminished by other people's opinions, criticism, or even cruelty. When trolls attacked me online or critics questioned my work, I felt sadness for their pain and ignorance. But I no longer internalized their words as truth about who I was. This emotional resilience had been tested repeatedly over the years. There had been the coordinated disinformation campaign I had weathered. There had been moments of doubt when setbacks made me question whether I was really making a difference. There had been personal health challenges that forced me to practice what I preached about separating health from worth. Through each of these trials, I had discovered reserves of strength and wisdom that I never knew I possessed. I had learned to see obstacles as opportunities for growth, criticism as information rather than verdicts, and failures as stepping stones rather than destinations. The leadership skills I had developed were being recognized far beyond the body positivity movement. I was serving on the boards of 3 national nonprofits, advising corporations on inclusion strategies, and mentoring other advocates who were working on various social justice issues. My approach to leadership had been shaped by my own experience of transformation. I led with empathy because I remembered what it felt like to be powerless. I listened carefully to marginalized voices because I knew how painful it was to be ignored. I focused on practical solutions because I understood that good intentions without concrete actions rarely create meaningful change. The consulting firm I had established, Thompson Inclusion Strategies, had grown to include a team of 12 specialists who worked with organizations across multiple sectors. We had helped hospitals reduce patient complaints and improve health outcomes through inclusive care practices. We had worked with tech companies to develop apps and platforms that promoted body positivity. We had advised government agencies on creating policies that protected civil rights while promoting public health. But perhaps the most satisfying aspect of my professional transformation was the mentorship and training work that had become central to my mission. I had developed a comprehensive curriculum for emerging advocates that covered everything from research and policy analysis to public speaking and media relations. The advocates who had come through our training programs were now creating change in their own communities and spheres of influence. They were doctors who had transformed their practices, teachers who had revolutionized their classrooms, business leaders who had created more inclusive workplaces, and parents who were raising confident, body-positive children. One of my proudest achievements was the Leadership Academy for Size Justice, a year-long program that trained advocates from underrepresented communities to become leaders in the body positivity movement. The Academy addressed the reality that the movement had sometimes been dominated by white, middle-class voices, and it worked to amplify the experiences and leadership of people of color, low-income individuals, and others who faced multiple forms of discrimination. The graduates of this program were creating some of the most innovative and impactful work in the field. They were addressing the intersections between weight discrimination and racism, developing programs for communities that had been overlooked by traditional advocacy efforts, and bringing perspectives that had enriched and strengthened our entire movement. My personal relationships had been transformed as well. The confidence and self-acceptance I had developed had allowed me to form deeper, more authentic connections with people. I was no longer constantly worried about whether others approved of my appearance or judged me for my size, which freed me to focus on the qualities that really mattered in relationships. I had even begun dating again, something that had seemed impossible in the early days of my journey. I had met William, a retired professor who shared my passion for social justice and who appreciated my intelligence, humor, and dedication to making the world better. Our relationship was based on mutual respect and shared values rather than physical attraction alone, and it had taught me what it meant to be loved for who I truly was. My relationship with my family had deepened as well. My daughter Sarah had become one of my strongest supporters, frequently accompanying me to speaking engagements and helping with the administrative aspects of my work. She had also begun her own advocacy efforts in California, working to address weight discrimination in educational settings. My granddaughter Emma, now in her second year of college, had become a formidable advocate in her own right. She had started a body positivity organization on her campus, had lobbied her university to implement more inclusive health and wellness programs, and was already being recognized as an emerging leader in the movement. "Grandma," she had told me during our last phone conversation, "watching you transform your life taught me that we don't have to accept the world as it is. We can work to make it the way it should be. You didn't just change yourself, you changed what I believed was possible for my own life." This intergenerational impact was one of the most meaningful aspects of my transformation. I knew that the changes I had made in my own life would ripple forward through my family for generations, freeing future women from the shame and self-limitation that had constrained previous generations. The spiritual dimension of my transformation had been equally profound. My faith had deepened and matured as I had learned to see myself the way God sees me, as a beloved child with inherent worth and infinite potential. I had moved beyond the shame-based Christianity that had dominated my early understanding to embrace a faith centered on love, acceptance, and justice. I was now serving on the National Board of Faith Communities for Body Liberation, an interfaith organization that worked to address weight stigma and promote inclusive theology in religious settings. We had developed resources that were being used by thousands of congregations to create more welcoming and affirming spiritual communities. My preaching and teaching had taken on new authority as well. I was regularly invited to speak at churches, seminaries, and religious conferences about the intersection of faith and social justice. My message was simple but revolutionary: that God's love is unconditional, that every body is sacred, and that creating inclusive communities is not just good social policy, but faithful discipleship. As I reflected on this complete transformation, I realized that the most important change wasn't in what I had achieved externally, but in how I understood my own agency and power. I no longer saw myself as someone who had things happen to her, but as someone who could make things happen. I had moved from being reactive to being proactive, from being defensive to being creative, from surviving to thriving. The woman who had once sat in a church pew feeling humiliated and powerless had become someone who could walk into any room with confidence, who could speak truth to power without fear, and who understood that her voice and experience mattered in the world. Most importantly, I had learned that transformation is not a destination, but an ongoing process. I was still growing, still learning, still becoming the fullest version of myself. The difference was that I now trusted my own capacity for growth and change, and I knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, I had the tools and support system to meet them with grace and strength. The cruel words that had once devastated me had become the foundation for a life of purpose, impact, and joy that exceeded anything I had ever imagined possible. I had not just overcome that moment of humiliation, I had transformed it into a gift that had blessed thousands of lives and would continue to create positive change long after I was gone. As I sit here today, 5 years after that transformative moment in our church sanctuary, I want to share with you the most important lessons I've learned about what it means to be a plus-size woman in this world, and what it means to transform pain into power, shame into strength, and personal healing into social change. First and most importantly, I want you to understand that your worth is not negotiable. It doesn't matter what the scale says, what size clothes you wear, or what anyone else thinks about your appearance. You are valuable because you exist, because you are a unique human being with gifts and perspectives that only you can offer. The world No one has the right to diminish that value, and you never have to earn your place in this world by shrinking yourself to make others comfortable. I spent 64 years of my life believing that my worth was conditional, that I had to prove my value through service, accommodation, and making myself as invisible as possible. I wasted decades apologizing for taking up space, for having needs, for existing in a body that didn't conform to society's narrow standards of acceptability. Those were years I can never get back, but they taught me something invaluable. That the only person who can give away your power is you, and the only person who can reclaim it is you. The transformation I experienced didn't happen because I lost weight, found the perfect outfit, or learned to hide my flaws more effectively. It happened because I decided to stop accepting poor treatment as if it were normal or deserved. It happened because I chose to see discrimination for what it really was, not a reflection of my inadequacy, but evidence of other people's prejudice and ignorance. This shift in perspective changed everything. Instead of asking, "What's wrong with me?" I started asking, "What's wrong with a world that teaches women to hate themselves?" Instead of trying to fix my body, I started working to fix the systems and attitudes that made life unnecessarily difficult for people like me. Instead of hiding from discrimination, I started challenging it directly. But here's what I want you to understand. You don't have to become a public advocate or start a movement to reclaim your power and transform your life. Change begins with how you treat yourself, how you talk to yourself, and what you're willing to accept from others. It begins with small acts of self-respect that gradually build into unshakable self-worth. It begins with refusing to apologize for ordering what you want at a restaurant. It begins with wearing colors you love instead of colors that hide you. It begins with taking up the space you're entitled to instead of making yourself smaller for other people's comfort. It begins with seeking medical care that addresses your actual health concerns instead of defaulting to weight loss as the solution to every problem. Every time you treat yourself with dignity and demand the same from others, you're not just changing your own life, you're changing the world for every other plus-size person who witnesses your confidence and self-respect. You're modeling possibilities that others might not have known existed. You're creating space for other people to step into their own power. The ripple effects of personal transformation extend far beyond what we can see or measure. When I started speaking up in our church support group, I thought I was just sharing my own experience. I had no idea that my words would eventually influence healthcare policy, change business practices, and inspire thousands of other people to find their own voices. I had no idea that my personal healing journey would become a movement that would impact lives around the world. This is the power that exists within each of us when we refuse to accept discrimination as inevitable and begin working for the world we want to live in. You don't need special credentials, perfect health, or ideal circumstances to create change. You just need the courage to believe that you deserve better, and the persistence to keep working toward that vision, even when progress feels slow. I want to acknowledge that this journey isn't easy. There will be people who try to shame you back into silence and invisibility. There will be moments when you question whether you're asking for too much, whether you should just accept things as they are. There will be setbacks and disappointments that make you wonder if change is really possible. But I promise you this: every step you take toward self-acceptance and self-advocacy makes the path easier for someone else. Every time you refuse to be diminished, you create space for other people to stand tall. Every time you challenge discrimination, you weaken its power over everyone who experiences it. The support system that sustained me through this transformation wasn't there when I started. We built it together, one conversation at a time, one person finding their courage at a time. That same support system is available to you now through online communities, local support groups, and advocacy organizations that are working to create a more inclusive world. You are not alone in this struggle, and you don't have to figure everything out by yourself. There are people who understand what you're going through, who celebrate your victories and support you through your challenges, who see your worth and potential even when you can't see it yourself. To the young women who are watching this, I want you to know that you don't have to spend decades learning to love yourself. You can start right now, today, by refusing to accept messages that tell you your worth is determined by your appearance. You can choose to see yourself as fearfully and wonderfully made, as someone with unique gifts and unlimited potential. To the women my age who think it's too late to change, I want you to know that transformation is possible at any stage of life. I was 67 years old when I finally learned to love myself, and some of the most meaningful and impactful years of my life have happened since then. It's never too late to reclaim your power, find your voice, and create the life you deserve. The legacy I want to leave isn't about my individual achievements or recognition. It's about the movement we built together, the lives that were changed, and the world that was made a little more just and inclusive because we refused to accept discrimination as normal. But most of all, I want my legacy to be the message that no one has to spend their life believing they are less valuable because of their size, their age, or any other aspect of their appearance. I want it to be the proof that ordinary people can create extraordinary change when they find the courage to demand better for themselves and others. Your life matters. Your voice matters. Your presence in this world matters. And when you fully embrace that truth, when you stop apologizing for existing and start celebrating your unique gifts and perspectives, you become an unstoppable force for positive change. The woman who mocked me in church 5 years ago thought she was diminishing me, but she actually set in motion a transformation that has blessed thousands of lives and will continue to create positive change for generations to come. That's the power of refusing to be diminished. That's the power of transforming pain into purpose. That's the power that exists within each of us when we choose love over shame, courage over fear, and action over acceptance of injustice. So stand tall, take up space, and never forget that you are exactly as worthy of love, respect, and dignity as any other person on this planet. The world needs what you have to offer, and it's time to stop hiding your light under a bushel of shame and self-doubt. Your transformation begins right now, with the simple but revolutionary decision to love yourself exactly as you are while working to become exactly who you're meant to be. If this plus-size empowerment story touched your soul, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, share with someone special, and write in the comments from which city and country you're watching.